If you recall, Sean used this phrase last week that I love. That movie hits me in all the feels. And if that makes me less of a man, I don't care that you think that. I love White Christmas. It's one of my favorites. I won't say it is my favorite, but it's in my top 5 favorite Christmas movies. I like a variety, but that's one of my favorites, and probably the first one I fell in love with as a kid. And I remember the first time I ever saw it. Now, my parents grew up with that movie, and it was one of my mom's absolute favorite movies. That and The Sound of Music. Anybody else? It was her number 1 and 2 top favorite movies, and so we watched those on constant replay in our house, and we loved musicals. I grew to appreciate them, and they can always transform me when you're having a bad day, with the exception of a couple of sad ones like Fiddler on the Roof and Les Mis. Most musicals will transport you and escape you when you're having a rough day, and this is one that did it for me, absolutely. I was in first grade the first time I watched this, and it was Christmas, and Dad bought a VHS. If you don't know what a VHS is, it's a little thing that winds, and when you got done with the tape, you had to actually put it in and hit a button and listen to it sound like it was going to break while it rewound all the way to the beginning again. It actually wasn't the greatest invention in the world because the tape wears out eventually, and then it doesn't become functional. But that's what we watched it on, and I was captivated. I turned this on, and I had no idea what kind of movie it was, and I saw these guys singing and dancing and all these great songs, and I was like, whoa, this is a great movie. And so we wore that tape out that entire Christmas break. We wore that tape out. Let me tell you, it was tough. And I work in schools now. I work in a high school now. I'm all about education. I'm all about being in school. But it was hard to go back to school as a first grader after the magic of that Christmas break. And now I have to sit and read and learn numbers and all this stuff. I'm not feeling that at all. I was so disappointed to have to go back to school. First day, I'm like, man, I want to get out of here. I want to go back to the couch, sit in my PJs, and watch Bing Crosby sing White Christmas again. Anybody else? Nobody likes to go back to school after the break. It's so disappointing. We're going to break into a story about some people who are very familiar with disappointment. Sean also alluded to this, that we're reading things in the Gospels that happened in the first century, but there's a lot of stuff before that that sets us up to get to the place where Emmanuel comes, the Advent happens. At kind of the high point of the Jewish nation was King David and King Solomon. That's when they had influence, and they had the lands that were promised to them, promised to Abraham generations prior. And then things quickly start to go south. And they have these series, the kingdom even splits, and there's a series of rulers, and some of them are good, and most of them not so much. And things just kind of downward trajectory for a long time. And there's all these prophets that are warning Israel, you're not doing what God set you apart to do. And things just keep getting worse until finally Babylon in 586 BC conquers Israel and carries the remainder of Israel off into captivity. Now you have to understand that is devastating for that nation in ways that we as a nation state just don't quite understand. Their whole identity as being Jews is largely predicated on the land that God promised them. So to be pulled out of it, to be uprooted out of it, is hugely devastating for the nation of Israel. And then after an exile, they do start to come back and repopulate the nation, but it's never like the glory days of King David and King Solomon. It's never like that again. And they go through these series of other larger nations like Greece and Persia, conquering them and ruling them. And so And there's even Sean talked about this, the so-called 400 years of silence when there's no writing prophets in the whole nation of Israel. And so they must feel untethered from the God that promised their ancestor long ago that he would bless the nations through them. And so we arrive in the first century, and now they're under the Roman government. And let me tell you, the Romans did some pretty cool stuff. I can't wait to go to Rome and see the Colosseum and all these things. They built some stuff that's just amazing. They did some pretty cool stuff. But if you're a student of history, you know they were also cruel tyrants. It was not a good thing to be subjugated to Roman rule. A lot of what made you had to give up. And one of those things was to call Caesar Lord, to treat him like God. This was not a good time to be a Jewish person. Moreover, it was not a great time for the two people we're going to read about, who had to endure a sort of desert of waiting in their life for blessing. And we're going to read in Luke 1, starting in verse 5. In Luke 1, verse 5, says, "In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron." What he's saying there is that they were of the priestly order of people. What's important about that is that even the priesthood was impacted by Roman rule. The high priest was essentially what we would call today a political appointee. It was somebody who rubbed elbows with the right people. Instead of God choosing him, it was, hey, he's got the right friends, let's put him in charge. So this is a big deal that Elizabeth and Zechariah are actually rightfully descendants of Aaron. They are rightfully priestly people. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. That word righteous there means right doing. But notice that God calls them righteous. It's not other humans that call them that. God sees them as righteous. And when Luke describes them as blameless, he's not saying that they're sinless. What he is saying is that they live upright lives. That word dikaios means that they follow God's law with pure hearts and absolute devotion to God. They are who God called Israel to be. They embody that. So if you remember, Jesus had lots of run-ins with religious folks. They're not like the Pharisees. The Pharisees were very legalistic, in a lot of ways self-righteous. And they're also not like the Sadducees, the other major group that Jesus dealt with, who frankly had a lot of unbelief in their lives. Zechariah and Elizabeth are not like that, and that's what Luke is trying to draw out. They live as God had called Israel to live. It's important to understand it if we're going to understand verse 7. Why does it matter that they were childless? Why does Luke point this out to us? It's because in that culture, when you're a married couple and you're well on into your marriage and you don't have a child, they had a belief that meant God was out to get you. You were cursed. You had something wrong with you. Maybe you had some secret sin that nobody knew about, and that's why you don't have kids. Because after all, God promised to Abraham that he would have children, and that was just a belief they had. My point is not to throw the first century Jewish people under the bus. That's just their culture. There were probably a lot of people that talked behind Zechariah and Elizabeth's backs about the fact that they didn't have children. It was a disgrace and a shame to be a married couple in those days and not be able to have children. It was seen as a sort of curse on your family. So they must have been terribly disappointed to be now Elizabeth's old enough that she can no longer have children. Presumably she's had menopause and she's no longer allowed or no longer able to have children. And so it must have been very discouraging, very disappointing, and a shame, both practically and personally. Remember, in those days, you didn't have Social Security. How did people take care of you? You had kids. And those kids, especially the eldest son, would take over your estate, and they would care for your estate, including you in your old age, if you should be blessed enough to live into old age. That's part of it, but there's also a personal aspect of it. Like I said, people will probably beginning to talk. They're well along in years. She's now past the point of being able to have kids, and yet they don't have any. They must have done something that God's not blessing them. It's ironic because Abraham has promised lots of descendants, but somehow Elizabeth and Zechariah seem to be left out of that promise. You see, difficult things are a reality in our world. Disappointment, death, disease, fill in the blank, whatever you want to put in that blank. They're a present reality in our fallen world. And it raises this question of what's called theodicy, the goodness of God. Where is God in difficult circumstances? We believe that he's good, but why do we believe that? Now, if you know me very well, you know I'm a huge C.S. Lewis geek. So you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to read a little bit of C.S. Lewis from one of my favorite stories. It's from the Chronicles of Narnia, hands down the best thing that C.S. Lewis ever wrote. The Chronicles of Narnia. If you do not own a copy of these books, Half Price Books is on Lane Avenue, and there's another one on Bethel Road. Go to these stores after service. You don't need to go get lunch. Lunch will still be there. Restaurants will still be open. Go to Half Price Books and get copies of these. These are great Christian literature. You will learn so much. They are intended for kids, but I am 40 years old. Every year I read these, and I learn from them. Absolutely wonderful ways that you can learn. What you need to know if you've never read them is Aslan, the great lion of Narnia, is not just a lion. He's the Christ figure of the stories. So if you understand that, then the stories will make sense to you. But I'm going to read a little bit from a story called The Magician's Nephew. And what's happened is Aslan has just created Narnia, similar to the Garden of Eden scene, and it's beautiful and it's pristine. But this little kid, Diggory, has already introduced an evil witch into the land. He did it accidentally, but through selfish choices. You see, he's trying to help his mom, which is a noble goal. His mom is deathly ill. She's probably going to die if somebody doesn't come up with something. If they don't have a miracle, his mom's not going to make it. And he's desperate. In his desperation, he makes trades, and those trades lead to bad outcomes for the whole land of Narnia. And now this evil's already been introduced on the first day that it's created. And so he's desperate. He knows his mom needs a miracle, but he's afraid to speak to the one person, Aslan, who he knows can do some good. And this is what happens. He finally plucks up his courage and comes and speaks to the lion. It says, Diggory kept his mouth very tight shut. He had been growing more and more uncomfortable. He hoped that whatever happened, he wouldn't blub, that's a fancy English word for a cry, or do anything ridiculous. Son of Adam, said Aslan, are you ready to undo the wrong that you have done to my sweet country of Narnia on the very day of its birth? Well, I don't see what I can do, said Diggory. You see, the queen ran away, and I asked, are you ready, said the lion. Yes, said Diggory. He had for a second some wild idea of saying, I'll try to help you out if you'll promise to help my mother. But he realized in time that the lion was not at all the sort of person one could try to make bargains with. But when he had said yes, he thought of his mother and thought of the great hopes he had had and how they were all dying away, and a lump came in his throat and tears in his eyes. And he blurted out, please, please, can't you give me something that will cure Mother? Up till then, he had been looking at the lion's great feet and the huge claws on them. Now, in his despair, he looked up at Aslan's face. What he saw in the lion's face surprised him as much as anything in his whole life. For the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of all wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment, and I love the way he describes this, he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. My son, said Aslan, I know grief is great. Only you and I know that yet. Let us be good to one another. Sean said this last week. God is not untouched by our pain, by our grief. He felt it personally. You don't think God grieved that his son was on a cross for the sins we had committed? He is familiar with the pain that we go through. I think it, just like in the story, it grieves him more than it grieves even us, and that's saying something. God is not unfamiliar with our pain. It's a part of this world. You see, people will say things still today, like what the people in the first century said. Oh, there must be something wrong with you, that God's not blessing you. You know, that something bad happened to you. But Jesus confronts that lie multiple times in the Gospels. In Luke 13, he's asked about some people that were martyred by Pilate. What was wrong with them? And Jesus says, well, I'm badly paraphrasing. Well, did they sin worse than other people? No, of course not. Or what about the people that died when the tower fell on them? There's dozens of people killed. Do you think they were worse sinners? No, they weren't worse sinners. And in John 9, the disciples even, Jesus heals a blind person. And they ask Jesus, well, what caused his blindness? Was it his sin or his parents? You see, this idea was fraught in their culture, that when something bad happens, that's God trying to get you, that God's got it out for you. You've done something wrong, and he's got it out for you. But bad circumstances are not proof that God is punishing you. They're not. Luke is addressing this misconception through the stories of Elizabeth and Zechariah. In verse 8, once, when Zechariah's division was on duty, and he was serving as a priest before God, he was chosen by Lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time of the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled, you think, and gripped with fear. Every time in the Gospels, this always makes me laugh. Every time, the angels always have to go, don't be afraid. Personally, that tells me I don't want to meet an angel. It doesn't sound like a very fun time. I don't know about you, but every time they have to put them at ease. It's not, don't be afraid. This is what the angel says to him. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. Now, the prayer that he heard is probably Zechariah and Elizabeth praying for a son. That's probably one of the prayers that the angel is referencing. But also, as a priest, part of his job was to pray for what they called the consolation of Israel. If you read about Simeon in Luke 2, he was a man who hung around the temple, and he was waiting for the consolation of Israel. That's a fancy way of saying he was waiting for the promised Messiah. And probably the angel's promise here is not just that you will have a son, but that son will have an integral part in this promised Messiah that you've been praying for all these years. Excuse me. Picking up again, he will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, because he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. You know, that name John means God is gracious, and he's so gracious in this moment to take away the shame of their moment, of living all this time without having kids, and to do so in such a miraculous fashion. And he promises wonderful things. Notice the results of his birth, that Elizabeth and Zechariah will be filled with joy, and that others will rejoice because of their son. John will live righteously like his parents and will do great things. Picking up in verse 16, he will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. Elijah's sort of the high water mark for Old Testament prophets. There's lots of Old Testament prophets, but he's kind of like the standard bearer. He's the one, if you remember, Israel is doing lots of terrible things, and there's all these prophets of Baal, that's a false god, and he has a showdown, and God shows up and totally wrecks their world. That's Elijah, same guy. He's the high water mark. So in other words, what he's saying is John's going to be legit. He's going to be the real deal, and people are going to remember him. Not shocking, 2,000 years later, we're still reading about him. To turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous. Listen to this. To make ready a people prepared for the Lord. You see, John's ministry will restore families, and John's ministry will restore the authority of righteous people like Zechariah and Elizabeth to prominence in the community. In other words, their voice will matter again. If you remember what I told you, Caesar was Lord, and he could make whoever he wanted to be in charge, including have some influence over their own cultic religion, their own religious worship. The high priest didn't serve legitimately. He served as a sort of political appointee. He was somebody who was installed by the person in charge, and if he didn't say the right things, didn't do the right things, he could be removed just as easily. It wasn't like the way God intended it. And so for him to say that John's message, John's ministry will have a part in bringing righteousness back into the community is no small thing. But best of all, John gets to prepare a way for the coming Messiah, the one that's going to set everything right, that was promised for centuries. John gets to play a part in his coming by preparing a way, preparing people's hearts. Imagine receiving this news. God will miraculously make the person who's unable to have kids have kids. This is something only God can do. Even today, medical science hasn't been able to reverse somebody going past the point of being able to have kids. Even with all the fertility stuff that we do today, this is a God thing. This is something, and especially in their crude understanding of science and medicine, this is a God thing. Only God is powerful enough to do that. And he's going to not only do that, but he's going to give you one of the most important blessings, one of the most important sons that they will talk about for centuries, that people will read about for centuries. You see, we serve the transcendent and all-powerful creator of the universe. He told Abraham and Sarah, similar situation. They're not able to have kids. She's well advanced in years, past the point of being able to naturally have children. He told him, you're going to have a son. You're going to have a child. And Sarah laughs. I love that they don't whitewash the humanity of these people. Sarah laughs at God, of all people. Laughs. And what does God say to her? He says, is anything too hard for the Lord? Of course, that's a rhetorical question, but when you think he spoke the world into existence, of course the answer is no, nothing is too hard for our God. He's all-powerful creator. And he continued to fulfill his promise to Abraham, as we see all the way in the first century in Elizabeth and Zechariah. He's still fulfilling that promise by giving them a son who will be great in the sight of the Lord. But Zechariah struggles to accept the reality of that and to believe that God will do that and can do that. And so he leaves the encounter unable to speak. But Elizabeth's reaction is very different. Let's read about it. In verse 39, or in verse 24 rather. After this, his wife, Elizabeth, became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days, he has shown favor and has taken away my disgrace among the people. She is blessed and she responds in faith, praising God. But God isn't done blessing her. She gets a visit from her more famous relative, Mary. And she has a similar reaction. In verse 39, it says, "At that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, when she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, 'Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of the Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is he who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promise to her.'" Again, her response is praise, not doubt. She prophetically recognizes that the son of Mary is the Lord. But she struggles, I think, to believe herself worthy of blessing. Notice what she says, "But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" Maybe she's used to being overlooked. Maybe she's used to be the one that people gossiped about. "Oh, what has Elizabeth done? She hasn't had any kids. Something wrong." Maybe she's used to that and she's internalized that too much. I don't know what her motivations are, but she seems to struggle with feeling worthy of being visited even by Mary. I think many of us can relate to that. I think like Diggory in the story, he's afraid to approach the lion. He doesn't think because of what he's done, he doesn't think he deserves to have an audience with the lion. And it takes a lot of courage to get him to that point. And I think a lot of us can relate to that. We feel like we don't deserve God's concern. We don't deserve an audience with the Lord. And we're surprised to find out that he cares. That's my favorite part of that story, is that he's surprised that the lion cares so much. Sometimes I think we're surprised that God cares so much that he would send his son for our sake. You see, our God is not just the transcendent, all-powerful creator. He's also immanent. That's a fancy theological word for he's close to us. He's near. He cares for us even in the little things. It's not like, I'm sorry if you're a Bette Midler fan, but it's not like From a Distance, that song where God starts the world like a clockmaker and then walks off and hits his bucket of balls if you're a golf person. That's the analogy. It's not like that. God is close. He cares about us. He's not distant. He's not off on some other place. He doesn't look at the earth from a wide scale. He's close. Yes, he's also all-powerful, transcendent creator. He spoke the world into existence, but he's also near like a friend. You see, the cross has both a cosmic and a personal aspect. There's both a God sent his son to fix what we had broken, but there's also a personal, you and me aspect to that he had us in mind. We're all created in his image, and he cares about all of us deeply. Because God is close, because God is loving, he cared that Elizabeth and Zechariah were disgraced. Yes, the major picture was that Jesus was coming and he was going to fix everything that was broken. But he still cared. God still cared about the disgrace, about people talking behind Zechariah and Elizabeth's back. "Well, you don't have any kids. There must be something wrong with you." He cared enough to address that issue. Read in verse 57 what results from that. It says, "When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy." You see, Elizabeth's pregnancy is more than good fortune. It displays God's transcendence, his all-powerfulness. Only God can take someone who is unable to conceive, who's past the point of menopause, presumably, and make it and reverse that and make a child like he promised. That's a God thing. But he's also close to them. He's also imminent, is the word, to them. He cares that people talk about them. He cares that in that culture that's a disgrace. And he wants to address their pain. You see, Elizabeth and Zechariah unboxed joy when John came. When he was born to them, they rejoice and they praise God in all circumstances. And it overflows into the community, and other people are even having joy because of their circumstances, because of God's blessing. You see, as Elizabeth and Zechariah learned, no circumstance is beyond God's power, and no detail is beneath his concern. He cares about his creation. He cares about the big picture, but he also cares about you and me. He cares about each one of us deeply and personally. Like I said, the cross has both cosmic, whole world implications, but it also has personal implications for you and I. But what about if you feel far from God? You know, that song at the beginning, Count Your Blessings, it's probably, it's a really catchy song and it's a nice practice. But sometimes that's not enough of a Band-Aid to just count your blessings and everything's going to be okay. What if that's not the case for you? What if you're going through the first Christmas you've had since you lost somebody close to you? That's a tough place to be. What if you got a diagnosis you don't like? That hurts. That's a tough place to be. What if you lost a job? I don't know. What if it's something, none of these, but it's something else? What if you feel distant from God? There's not an easy fix that you can just sing a song and everything will go away. But you see, Advent is a time for joy. It celebrates the coming of the Christ, the coming of the Messiah. But it's definitely hard to rejoice when we're in the midst of disappointment or tragedy. So my question is, what keeps you from unboxing joy this year? Whatever it is, wrestle with it. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. There's no healing that comes from pretending things don't exist. Lean in. Lean in. The band is going to sing a song, and the song is Elizabeth singing to her baby John. And John is going to prepare the way. And what if right now we just prepare our hearts to meet God, that we prepare our hearts to draw near to God? I don't know what he has to say to you in the midst of you're going through difficult. Maybe you're going through difficult. But if you are, I don't know what God has to say to you. But I know that he desperately wants relationship with you. He wants to hear from his children. He wants you to be close because he's close. He wants relationship with you. So let's draw near to God in this moment, regardless of what our circumstances are. He wants to have relationship with us. He wants to hear from us because he cares. We are his children, and he's a good father. Let us prepare our hearts by getting close to God, whatever our circumstances.